Okay. Hello, everybody who is attending this panel. Welcome. This is the ACLU of Delaware's CLE presentation on education equity. Today's focus is on discrimination in public school discipline. And we have a wonderful panel of experts here to help shape our conversation today. For accessibility purposes, in the More section, there should be a show captions feature. And also there is a Q&A button that we will be looking to answer questions if there's time, ideally the last 15 minutes of the presentation. My name is Tobi Omotoso. I am an Education Equity Fellow at the ACLU, and my focus is on resource and discipline disparities in Delaware public schools. Um, Here today to shape our discussion are Shannon Griffin, who is a former senior policy advocate at the ACLU of Delaware, and Professor Aaron Kupchik. Additionally, attorney Sarah Hinger will be joining us later on in the discussion. But for now, I will introduce two of our panelists. First, Aaron Kupchik is a professor of sociology and criminal justice at the University of Delaware, who studies school policing and punishment. He earned his doctorate in sociology at NYU. His work on school policing and punishment has been published in numerous academic journals, and he has written several books on the topic, including his recent Suspended Education, School Punishment, and the Legacy of Racial Injustice. He's often asked to present his research on this topic for audiences that include the U.S. House of Representatives and a number of committees of the National Academies of Sciences. His work has been awarded the American Society of Criminology's Michael Hindling Book Award and the American Society of Criminology's Outstanding Young Scholar Award, among others. Additionally, we have Shannon Griffin, who most recently, as I mentioned, worked as a senior policy advocate with the ACLU of Delaware, where she combined policy advocacy with direct support for families and schools. She also co-created the Fair Discipline Toolkit and accompanying training series, which helps educators implement equitable and restorative approaches to discipline that promote accountability and problem solving. Currently, she serves as the Director of Community and School Partnerships with the Route 9 CDC Student Advocacy Center. Her work centers on advancing education equity and eliminating disparities in schools through innovative policies, programs, and practices. She also designed and leads the Education Equity Ambassador EEA program, an initiative that empowers families in chronically underperforming schools to take an active role in local and district level decision making. I'll introduce Attorney Hinger when she joins us. But first, just to start the discussion, to both of you, what is school discipline and what does it generally look like today? Um,
Shannon, do you want to start or shall I?
Take it away, sir.
All right. I'll start and then you could add if you wish. School discipline, well, it resembles all sorts of things. Over the last couple of generations, we've invested very heavily in exclusionary school punishments, such as out-of-school suspension, in-school suspension, and more rarely expulsion, where students who misbehave, they'll get a referral for out of class or from another staff member at school. They'll go to the office and often be sent home for a period of time. School discipline is most commonly in response to relatively minor forms of misbehavior, behavior that might be very troubling and difficult for a teacher to deal with. In other words, it is disruptive, but not behavior that puts people in danger, typically. Real violence, substances like drugs and alcohol, weapons, and so on, the things we're really afraid of, tend to be very rare in our schools, thankfully, as is violence. So, um, so school discipline is a common response from schools that often takes on an exclusionary aspect.
Shannon, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that was really, I think what we've seen over the years, I would say maybe the past, excuse me, 7 to 10 years is more of a, maybe 5 years, more of a push for more restorative kind of practices. So that's good. We do see more schools trying to acknowledge the fact that, the zero tolerance policies aren't productive or working. And so we do see more willingness for schools to try restorative practices. However, much more training needs to be done in this area because, quite frankly, what we see called restorative practices really is not. And so, some of the pushback that we see from schools saying this doesn't work, it's because they're really not implementing restorative practices with fidelity. I hear most often restorative practices means we're just giving these kids a pass and they're not held accountable, and that's not at all what restorative practices is. So we do see more of a shift toward restorative practices, certainly not nearly as much as we need to see in Delaware schools.
And
If I can add to that as well,
yeah,
before
absolutely.
moving on, I appreciate that point, Shannon. And I think I want to just echo that how important it is to have that shift and to do that shift well, to fully implement restorative practices. There is an abundant body of research now looking at the outcomes of exclusionary school punishment, finding that overall it harms students. While people could disagree over whether, there are cases, in my opinion, there are some cases where it might be necessary to make sure that everyone is safe, but those are relatively rare, far less common than we see exclusionary punishment being given out. And the consequences are bad. It does not help the student misbehaves. It actually makes their behavior worse in the long term. It doesn't help the teacher in the long run. It doesn't help the classroom left behind, the classroom who doesn't get punished. It hurts parents. It hurts the student who gets suspended long term in terms of their academic career, their risk of arrest and incarceration, and all sorts of long-term problems. So it's an ineffective solution to a real problem of student misbehavior. Thank you.
And so a lot of mention of like exclusionary policies being prioritized. And I'm wondering, has that always been the case in schooling? Like, has discipline always focused on removing students from schools?
I'll go as long as I can recall. That's just been the normal way of doing things. And so trying to introduce things like restorative practices, restorative justice, are relatively new concepts in education. So certainly the idea of just, you do some, therefore you need to be punished. And I think just broadly, when we think about how we as a society deal with issues, it's we tend to go to the punishment first. You have to be punished. You have to, and so schools have always aligned with that philosophy.
Yeah, that's what we've seen over the past 50 or so years, in our lifetimes on this call. I recently wrote a book on this subject, on thinking about the history of how this came to be, on when did we start doing this. And I mean, the idea from the book came from just wondering, when did it first seem a good idea to suspend children out of school, given that it doesn't help and only creates more problems long term. And what I found was that before desegregation, we didn't suspend children out of school often. We didn't use much exclusionary punishment. Now, we did use other problematic punishments, often corporal punishment, but also we didn't call it that. But you see more instances of restorative practices going back before desegregation. And in Delaware specifically, like before Delaware, Newcastle County specifically, schools desegregated in the 1970s, out-of-school suspension rates were incredibly low. As soon as schools were forced to desegregate by federal court order, they there was a lot of resistance to desegregation. And they kicked kids out, particularly Black students who were admitted with resistance to formerly all-white schools. So the current patterns we see began about 50 years ago after desegregation as a form of resistance to court-ordered racial desegregation of schools.
That's fascinating and very depressing. Um, does is there like, because I imagine the rejoinder is that you know, oh, these kids are bad and there is a need to impose harsher punishment. You even mentioned, both of you mentioned that like people will respond to um calls for like restorative justice with the idea that, oh, that's not going to work. Students will not respond to that structure well. What kind of policies kind of lead people or lead students to get brought into that system? Were there things that changed in other aspects of the school that made suspension a more likely outcome for students?
I think Aaron touched on a really good point when we talked about what happened after DSEG. And I think even before we get to what's written, what's the why things are written the way they are. And I think we can't ignore the elephant in the room, which is racism and implicit bias, right? So those things drive the policy, which drive the practice. And so we know that this is a huge issue. And we know that when we look at the rates of referrals and the rates of disciplinary action. And just as an example, a Black student can be doing the same kinds of behaviors as a white student. And what we know factually by looking at the data is that that Black kid will be punished much more harsher than the white kid for doing the same exact thing. So it's not like Black kids are more inherently violent or more inherently given to, behaving or acting up. No, it's when these behaviors show up, oftentimes in some schools 2 to 4 times more, in some schools even more than that. Black kids, brown kids, students with special needs will be excluded more harshly, will be punished more harshly for the same types of offenses. So I always want to make sure when I do these kinds of presentations that I hit this home. It's not that Black and brown kids are more inherently violent. They're not. They're doing the same things as their white peers. They're just punished more harshly for doing it.
And Professor Kupchak, giving you space, did you want to add anything to that, or is that?
Um, I thought that was a great answer. I mean, I think yeah, it's a related point to your question is, how do we bring about more restorative practices? I think that there's such a common, frequent misunderstanding of alternate mechanisms like restorative practices or positive behavioral intervention supports, social emotional learning, what have you. That Shannon said, teachers often think, well, it's just ignoring the misbehavior. And I couldn't disagree more. These alternative practices to avoid exclusionary punishment, they still hold students accountable, right? But they do so in ways that communicate that the student is still a valued member of the community, and they do so in ways that help solve the problem rather than exclude a child for 3 days from a site of caring and education, right? Communicating that they're unwanted. Again, this was why, as I found, exclusionary punishment like suspension became so common to begin with. It was a way of communicating that Black students were unwanted in formerly all white spaces. And it became institutionalized. It became part of what schools do, right? So that might not be what schools intend today, but 50 years ago, we set in practice or we created this practice and established it. And now it crowds out other options so that when we try to implement restorative practices, or other evidence-based practices, meaning that evidence shows these will help reduce misbehavior more than exclusionary punishment. It's hard to do so because we're so set in our ways of excluding students.
And just from actual policy, we do still see zero tolerance policies, meaning there is no opportunity even for administrators who want to have a more equitable way of doing things because these things are prescribed in policy. One example that we see over and over is when it comes to fighting, right? So if two kids get in a fight, zero tolerance says they both have to be equally punished. Well, it's against human nature. If someone is attacked or someone is being, aggressively, if they're being harmed in some way, nature says, I'm going to defend myself, right? Well, our policy said, well, even if you defend yourself, you're going to still receive punishment because you defended yourself. It just doesn't even make any sense. But we see that. We see that time and time again. And so so zero tolerance says that we can't allow for those kinds of nuances when it comes to students and their behaviors. So zero tolerance policies, I mean, it's a quick and easy way of doing things, right? You don't think about it. What does our code of conduct say? This is what we're going to do. You get 2 days, you get 5 days. And it's not it's a harmful practice that we really need to do our best to do away with altogether.
And I'll even add, this is kind of a bit of a full circle thing for me. I remember in middle school, I got in a fist fight with another kid back when I used to get into fist fights. And and he had called me a racial slur, and that's why it had happened. And I remember we went down to the office, the whole thing happened, we both got sent home, and I got suspended and he didn't. But I have parents who have like advanced degrees and are comfortable being in these spaces. So they went to the school on my behalf and they argued with the school about it. And so the other kid got suspended. But if I don't have the resources I have resources that most people don't have. So what happens in that situation is I get suspended, the white kid doesn't, and the disparity just happens. But
Right.
that, I guess, leads me to another question. How do these exclusionary policies, how do these zero tolerance policies reshape the culture and atmosphere in schools? How do they have an impact on the way schools tend to, relate to students, how students relate to each other, etc.?
That's a great question, because and it's a very important question. They're very meaningful. You know what? And I'm going to answer in 1 second, but let me make a related point first, which is that what research finds is that one of the best strategies overall, the kind of broad general strategies for preventing student misbehavior and even crime in schools, is to create an inclusive social climate within the school. An inclusive climate is a place where students feel wanted, cared for, where they matter, they're listened to, a place where there's trust and bonds, not just between students and students, but students and adults in the school, and adults with each other in the school. So it's a place that is inclusive in those ways. And when we have zero tolerance policies, when we have harsh punishment policies, we're eroding that climate. We're creating a hostile climate, and the opposite of an inclusive climate, right? We're creating a hostile climate where we're communicating to students, you're not wanted here. Imagine if a family decides that a 16-year-old, they're upset at the 16-year-old for breaking house rules, so they're kicked out of the family for 3 days. That would be ridiculous, right? We don't do that. That could lead to a call from Child Protective Services. But that's what schools do every day, right? And the reason that families don't do that is because the child is still loved. You would hold them accountable. There would be, they would lose privileges. They would have to compensate for what they do. I mean, every family works in different ways, right? But you don't kick them out of the family temporarily or permanently for making a mistake. So when we do these practices, we're eroding one of the most promising aspects of behavior management, and that's inclusivity in our climate.
And I think it should be, noted that um, it's palpable. I don't know if anyone's actually been into a zero tolerance kind of environment where, rules are first, people are second. You can feel it, you can sense it in the environment when you walk in. You can sense it, or you can see it with the attitudes that Dr. Kupchik was saying between staff members themselves, right? You can look at absentee rates. Absentee rates are higher in those kind of zero tolerance environments. Absentee rates are higher among staff in these environments. And I came across a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research. It was a long-term study, and it found that students assigned to schools that have higher rates of suspensions are significantly more likely to have contact with the criminal justice system. And what was really notable was those kids that were exposed to higher suspensions environments, right? So these are not kids actually being suspended. If you're in a higher suspension environment, you are 15 to 20% higher likely of being arrested or incarcerated as an adult, right? So just being in those environments make you more likely. So you don't have to be the kid that in an environment that's getting pushed out at the time. It's just being in an environment, you are then more susceptible later to have encountered the criminal justice system. And so that's a really, to me, that really struck me, because we're focused in on just those kids who are directly impacted, right? Those kids are being suspended multiple times. But being in that environment actually impacts the entire school body. And I think that should be something that should be noted and addressed.
Standardized test scores too. Of the kids who aren't suspended tend to have lower, on average, standardized test scores when they're in higher suspension schools. I mean, yeah, it's eroding to the things that the school wants to do.
That is a really fascinating point. And I think on top of that, I think that begs the question, um, what type of communities do we see these policies in? Do we tend to see these across the board? Do we see these in all kinds of schools, in low income and high income? Do we see these in particular demographic sections of the general, like national community?
Aaron, you want to go first?
Sure. I was just thinking I'm talking too much, but I'm happy to go for it. It is a really complicated question. The answer that often comes as well, I'm sorry, give me a second. You see these kinds of policies in all sorts of communities, but they have different impacts across communities. So, in particular, think of communities as schools. Schools with more students of color and with more low-income students, they tend to have more invasive security. They tend to have harsher punishments. They tend to have more zero-tolerance policies. That doesn't mean that more privileged schools or schools with more white middle-class students are immune from these practices, but they tend to have different consequences and be more invasive, more harsh driven, more punitive in schools with more students of color and more low-income students.
And that's exactly what we see in our work. So in the Student Advocacy Center, one of our main areas of work is actually working with students who have been negatively impacted, or students who have had their rights violated or have been excluded, right? And so it's an opportunity for families to be assigned an advocate. An advocate is a free service, so it mitigates the need for litigation, for instance, right? And so we actually assign the family an advocate to actually work with the schools to address whatever violations that may have occurred. And so what we see in our work locally in Delaware is about 80% of our cases are Black kids or students with disabilities, right? Or students with special needs. That makes up 80% of our clients. We serve populations at Delaware in all three counties. And so that actually backs up what we research that we see naturally, right? And if you're in an environment, just to support what Dr. Kupchik was saying, if schools have higher rates of poverty, if they have higher rates of students of color, you are going to see typically, right? There are always some outliers here, there, but you're going to see typically more higher rates of suspensions overall, and then more higher rates of suspensions among Black, brown kids and students with special needs.
Thank you both for those answers, which were incredibly thorough and very, very useful. I noticed that attorney Sarah Hinger has joined us. So I am going to introduce her. Sarah Hinger is Deputy Director of the ACLU's National Racial Justice Program. Her work includes protecting the right to learn in K-12 and higher education, defending the rights of student and youth against discriminatory discipline and policing, and defending the ability of public and private institutions to pursue equity and inclusion. Her recent work includes leading the ACLU's challenge to the Department of Education's Dear Colleague letter on DEI, NEA versus ED, and CYAP versus Wilson, which struck down criminal laws applied to students in an arbitrary and discriminatory manner, disproportionately criminalizing Black students for common adolescent behavior. Welcome, Sarah Hinger. And something I want to ask just to kind of bring you into the conversation, we've been discussing a lot of the historical context of the development of kind of an exclusionary disposition in public school discipline. And I'm wondering, in your work, what kind of specific policies you've seen that kind of seem to be like an outflow of the exclusionary atmosphere in schools?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for joining and being here. From what I've heard so far, I just have to second and lift up everything that both Shannon and Aaron have offered here. So, um, when we are looking at discriminatory policies and thinking about how they impair and violate students' rights, it can really take different shapes. So sometimes there are policies that are very prescriptive and discriminate on the basis of the policy themselves. So, for example, a lot of dress code policies that are, for example, restrictions on how students can wear their hair. Can they wear locks or longer hair for boys? Um, those target often manners of dress and grooming that are particular to Black students and communities or other um, students of color, for example. And those are sort of rigid and clear in their disparate use and application to students. Then there's also policies that are unclear and allow for a whole lot of interpretation. So those are some of the things like we challenged in our case, CYAP, which is the Carolina Youth Action Project. And in this case, it was criminal laws, but these can be discipline, school-based rules as well, that target things like disorderly conduct or disruption. Those are really broad categories. And if any adult thinks about, have you ever been annoyed at a kid's behavior? Have you ever found a teenager to be disruptive? Probably every teenager has um, been that. Every child has caused those feelings in adults at some point in time. But how does a teacher, an administrator, a police officer in a school decide when a child is being an annoying child, when they maybe need some redirection from a caring teacher, or when they've committed a crime? And what we see and what we saw in the application in this case, but also see frequently across the application of these types of rules, is that they're applied differently on the basis of race, as well as to disability and across gender. So we see Black students, for example, engaging in behaviors that are perceived as adults to be criminal, where their white counterparts, for example, um, would perhaps be reprimanded or not. They can also be applied to, behaviors that are actually symptoms of disability, where a separate body of law would require, for example, support services to address a student's needs. Um, but a police officer in the school, an administrator can, at the same time, flip to resort to a criminal law and um, avoid all of the safeguards that should be in place under disability rights laws. We also see this applied to girls of color discriminatorily. They experience adultification bias in particular. Dress codes are applied often very discriminatorily in this way, as well as other sort of perceptions of behavior. And these laws can also be used not just to target students who are behaving in a way that might require redirection, but when students are behaving entirely within their rights and are trying to assert and protect themselves. So, what we saw in our case in South Carolina, for example, was that a student witnessed her classmate being physically assaulted, taken to the ground by a police officer. She saw the administrator and the teacher, adults in the room, were not intervening to do anything. And she spoke out. She asked for someone to stop this. She told her fellow students to document what was happening. And as a result, the police officer turned around and arrested her for causing a disruption. So I use that example to emphasize that there's times also when these laws are can be used to silence students, to diminish their own capacity and rights when they assert them in schools. So, these are the types of policies that and the ways that different types of policies can be um, wielded against students. There's a range of concerns. There's Fourth Amendment rights to physical safety. There's due process rights to the types of processes and procedures. I mentioned rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act and IDEA. There's the right to be free from discrimination. And there's also a particular right to fundamental fairness under the 14th Amendment that particularly prevents against laws and rules that allow for arbitrary and discriminatory enforcement. So that's those types of disturbing and disruptive rules. So that's just a few of the things we think about from the legal angle. And I want to emphasize, those are the rights to be free from these types of things. And it's just as important that these types of negative interventions are a band-aid that are taking the place of the types of positive supports and services and school environments that we want to see that Shannon and Aaron talked about, and sort of what we want to envision as a positive right to education, a positive right to the ability to develop as a young person and have the resources to become, a fully uh, welcomed and enabled member of our, democratic society. So on the flip side of those rights to be free from all this negative treatment, um, there's the idea that there is a possibility of this much more positive and affirming education that our students and every student it should have and is entitled to.
Remarkably comprehensive answer. Thank you so much for that, Sarah. I want to ask both Aaron and Shannon, I guess, off that. Do we see this in Delaware? Do we see in Delaware that these types of, you know, both zero tolerance or possibly discriminatory disciplinary policies manifest in Delaware schools? And if so, how? How is it like possibly similar to a lot of the things Sarah mentioned? Um, how are they different?
In a word, yes. we we absolutely do see that everything that Sarah described, uh, pretty much to the T in our schools in Delaware. I mean, that's the short answer. Yes, we do see that.
And Shannon is most certainly the expert on the local school scene and helping children and parents here in Delaware. I also want to add, and I agree obviously with her and with Sarah, great points. But you see this everywhere, right? You see this everywhere in schools across the United States. You see it in wealthier districts and poorer districts. You see it in rural areas and urban areas. You see it everywhere. This is a function of how we have, over the last couple generations, decided it's baked into how we run schools and how we create policies and how we um, support teachers. Right. This is one consequence, for example, of insufficient support for teachers, which is a problem everywhere. Right. If I'm teaching 35 students in a classroom and one is making that difficult by being an annoying teenager, right? If I don't have any support, if I have too large a class, I have no teacher aid, I don't have enough support, I might resort to an office referral and then a principal kicks them out. Right? So it's a consequence not of educators going, who mean to do harm necessarily. It's just a problem or a consequence of our educational system nationwide.
And Director Griffin, I'm gonna hone in on you, I guess, a little bit more, but can you say, I guess, a bit more specifically, what you see in Delaware that is going on to the extent that you feel comfortable.
Right. No, no, for sure. So I mean, without naming specific schools, right? Because it is pervasive across Delaware. But in schools that have higher populations of Black students, that have higher populations of students with special needs, you are going to see, just on average, you're going to see higher rates of out of school suspensions, in school suspensions. You're going to see a climate that is more about power and control. Again, it's about power and control first, people second. That you are, those are the characteristics that you're going to see in those buildings. You are going to see an SRO, right? Or a constable, which is the same thing, just without a formal badge, right? You're going to see that in Delaware. It's interesting because right after the killing of George Floyd, we saw more of an emphasis on, there was more of a push, a more opening to restorative kind of practices, right? More of the willingness to see the kind of racial disparity that we see in discipline. And there was a push then to remove SROs for what we know is more evidence-based practices, right? It's going to actually more ways to actually keep our kids safe than having an armed guard in your building, right? There's research is really clear on that. We have gotten away from that. I think a lot of the political climate kind of drives that, right? And so we're seeing a shift now back toward, we have to be tough on kids. We have to be, this kind of, we have to come down on these kids. We're starting to see a shift, unfortunately, back. So the pendulum is begin to switch back to that. So I don't have to get specific in schools. The data will, if you just look at the makeup of the building, you can right, look at the makeup in the building. The data will pretty much follow the same things that we're saying now in trends about who's being disciplined and for what.
Thank you, Director Griffin. I guess now we know the lay of the land a little bit. We know what it looks like nationally. We know the history. We've seen some of the different policies and how it affects Delaware. Um, what can we do? Like how do the people in this call? I know many of the people who are attending are parents. And I guess I'm wondering what different ways of advocacy are available. What can parents do? What can lawyers do? What types of schools might be more positive examples, especially like in Delaware, of how to manage student discipline? Just kind of from your expertises, what do you think?
I'll start, but I'm sure my colleagues have better ideas. And there two things come to mind. One is I really appreciate the opportunity to be in this session, and I think that more dialogue is really important. We don't have nearly enough dialogue about this issue. There are so many assumptions that people commonly have about school discipline and school policing that are just wrong. And when I say wrong, it's not like I know everything with a crystal ball, but that a lot of evidence suggests otherwise. And maybe we'll refine that evidence, but we have to go with the best of what we know with high quality empirical research. So more dialogue is important. And second is to support schools more. As long as schools feel under the gun, under pressure, understaffed, underpaid, they're at risk of taking easy solutions, which is kicking kids out, arresting them, and so on, rather than helping kids to solve their problems and building those children and their capacities and so, by supporting them. That's difficult, and it takes time and it takes resources. It's well worth it, and it can save a lot of time and resources in the long run, but it's an investment up front. And as long as schools are under the gun, they're less likely to do that. And the third is communicating to your school boards that you want to see these programs implemented. One thing I've heard many times from administrators and school board members and superintendents is that they're afraid of liability, and they're afraid that if they don't have police officers and zero tolerance policies, that parents will think they're not doing everything they should to keep their children safe. Right. So part of it is that they believe they're responding to their constituents and their constituents' desires, and they are. These things all work together, right? I'll pass it on, please.
No, I think Aaron, that were really great suggestions. And I always say, knowledge is power and involvement is everything. So we have to make folks aware that this is an issue, that it's pervasive here in Delaware. This is not oh, that just happens over there in Philadelphia or in Baltimore. No, it's happening here in Delaware. So I think we have to really make more people aware what's happening. I think we have to help to provide more supports to what Aaron was saying to our schools. We have to demand that, educators receive the kind of professional development around this, that they're supported, there's coaching that's ongoing. We have to work to empower parents to understand what their rights are, and how they can engage. And so, I actually conduct, it was mentioned in an intro, the Education Equity Ambassadors Program, which is specifically for parents in our state to come and learn how to navigate the school system, understanding their rights, what district teams are available, how they can be part of the decision-making process, how they can go to their school boards, mobilize to go to their school boards to demand more restorative practices, to demand more supports for educators, right? Outside of formalized training, Aaron talked about being active. You have to go to your school board. You have to vocalize this is what you want to see in your schools. We always talk about budgets where we don't have the money. And quite frankly, we do, right? There's enough money when you look at what's already embedded in the system. It's about priority and where we want to spend the money, right? And so we are not going to see the kind of academic achievement that we all agree we want to see if we don't address the culture in these buildings, if we don't improve the culture in the buildings. Education, and Aaron talked about this too, bears it out. Research bears it out. In these buildings where these are the policies and the practices, you're going to see lower achievement. So if we're saying we want to see higher achievement for all kids, you have to address the cultural aspect. You have to make our schools more inclusive. And you have to do that by training those people who are actually in contact with our kids. We have to train and engage our kids, involve them in this process. It's not about the adults down. In fact, it shouldn't be. This should be community wide, right? The school community should be developing these policies and practices, right? Students should be drivers of this because they are the main people that are impacted by it. Where is their voice in all of this, right? So we have to shift in how we are looking at how we're even, how we want to address the issue. There is a plethora of research of what works. We know social emotional learning type strategies work. We know different kinds of restorative practices work. We know positive behavioral support work. We know what works. And so we have to begin to mobilize and organize and push the systems to do more of what we know work, and call out when we see that it's not working.
Deputy Director Hinger.
Yeah, I mean, all of this is the real solutions. The things that we know are available. We just have to be advocating and pressing for them to be implemented in our schools and in all schools, evenly with the resources that students deserve. Again, I'll just speak to it from the legal lens because everyone has already said much of the, what's there. But I think, um, knowing your rights as a parent and a student in terms of the disciplinary process, because the biggest thing there is being able to have your voice heard, have a say before decisions are made in that process, whenever possible. When a student has an advocate with them in, let's say, a suspension hearing, it makes an incredible difference in the outcomes, because it ensures that there is more thought given, more care towards students' right and their point of view. So thinking through those things, looking at the policies and practices. So what is the school's code of conduct or approach to culture? That shouldn't just be a list of rules that students are required to obey. It should be standards and expectations for everyone in the school community, including positive expectations, and ways that students can be can learn those behavioral skills, those social skills that are as important as reading and writing. Um, Thinking about police in schools, what sort of access do they have to students? What are they allowed to do in schools? What are they enforcing? What types of weapons are they carrying? What's their role there? Should they be there at all? Are they there principally to respond to outside threats? Are they being used to address and fill in to manage student behavior? Those are all things to look at, analyze, and address through sort of the policies that guide how we think about school culture. And ultimately, as I said before, when things are not done well, they can end up violating students' rights, including their constitutional rights. And if that's something you're concerned about, you can contact a legal organization such as the ACLU of Delaware to talk about and assess that type of thing as well.
And I will be throwing my email in the chat before um, we wrap up here. But I guess one other thing I wanted to ask about to everyone, but especially Director Griffin, because I imagine you're more familiar. Are there any schools in Delaware that have put forth more restorative models of school discipline or student rehabilitation? Are there any shining stars amongst our educational community?
Yeah, there actually are a couple bright spots. In Newcastle, I would say Newcastle Charter School is a really good example of creating an inclusive environment. They do a lot around helping students to be a part of the process. Like students lead the peer mediation, right? So they actually help to drive those conversations when conflict exists. It's an amazing thing to see a third grader initiating a peer mediation session. It's unbelievable to see. Um, Downstate in Sussex, Love Creek Elementary, the principal there, she does an amazing job. She did an amazing job of turning around the culture there. And it's again, it's palpable when you look at her achievement numbers among spec ed students, which is generally low across the state. She's outpacing because of, again, how she works with her staff, how her staff has been trained and supported to engage students, right, of all different levels. So I think those two right off the bat come to mind as far as, bright spots and what can be possible.
Amazing. I see one question in the Q&A that I want to put out, and to the rest of the attendees, please feel free to submit more questions. We've got 11 minutes here where we can take advantage of the wealth of knowledge that we have in this panel. But one question put forth was what specific resources or practices are missing in schools to prevent harsh discipline? Are there specific effective evidence-based practices that could be supported and implemented? And I feel like this has been gestured to a bit and discussed some in specific, but are there anything else that kind of come along um, that the
Yeah,
line?
so just to reiterate kind of what we talked about already, when you're talking about social emotional learning. I know the DOE, our Department of Education, has some supports around providing services to help schools embed those practices, professional development training. So schools can lean into our DOE to request some more supports around social emotional learning. Um, Dr. Terry Lawler has been phenomenal at the DOE in helping schools do more social emotional learning and trauma informed, trauma responsive type practices. When you talk about restorative practices, right? That is, it is just that it's a practice. It's not, and it's a skill, right? So it's about learning, understanding how harm impacts community, making those kind of connections, building relationships so that when harm is done, right? that there is a sense of community. You're not just going to cast someone aside. So restorative practices, getting formalized training on that and those different there are specific strategies that are embedded in restorative practices that more schools can be doing. So there are actually some concrete um, strategies that schools can employ. But again, you can't just know it. You have to practice it. You have to be coached on it. You have to be held accountable for doing it. Right. And so what I see in my work is we usher students, we usher educators in for their PD day. They get all this great stuff. They go away back in their classrooms and they're back in their silo. We don't, well, how are you working it? How is it working? What kind of things can you tweak? How can we support you? And so people just go back to it's what they know. So they're going to fall back into old patterns and habits of being if there's no accountability and ongoing support to make sure that those practices actually become embedded and actually stick. And I'm going to stop talking now.
I think that was brilliant. I think that's so important, focusing on implementation. It's a great question of what schools should be doing, and there are all these practices on the books. And in my research, looking at schools across the country, so many schools now say they do these things, and so many of them do them poorly because the very things Shannon just said about implementation. It takes courage and resources to implement things like restorative practices well. And by courage, I mean, you don't what a lot of schools do as an illustration is they'll do both. They'll say, okay, well, we're afraid to back away from the exclusionary punishment, so we're going to do both. You're suspended for 3 days, and then when you come back, you go to a mediation. Well, you're undoing the positive benefit of mediation if you're removing them from the school for 3 days, right? You're not doing it right in that case. So what do schools need? It's not great question. Shannon addressed all of these different practices. They're evidence-based, like restorative practices, A1 on that list. But it takes the courage among schools to implement it well, the know-how to implement it well, the practice, it's not easy.
Thank you guys both for your answers to that question. Amazing. Specifically to Deputy Director Hinger, uh, how has litigation been used to kind of advance student equity in school discipline? And what type of policies have been challenged successfully? Conversely, what policies might be harder to kind of challenge that are still kind of problematic?
Yeah, so I think the way I think about litigation is as one tool. It's not going to solve everything just through the court case. But it's a tool to be used in conjunction with empowering the community with being organized and involved in the policies and practices that are affirmatively put in place in schools. But I think litigation is really important for shining a light sometimes, bringing policymakers to the table to talk through things and telling a story about why these practices and the harms matter. Um, so I think litigation can do all of those types of things. So we have and others have successfully litigated a range of things. I think each case looks a little bit different depending on the needs and what's happening in the community or in the state, and trying to best address the issues there, and what you're hoping to achieve. So, um, you know, we have successfully challenged criminal laws, and in some places, school rules have also been challenged on the grounds that they are too open to arbitrary and discriminatory enforcement in a way that harms students of color, students with disabilities, for example. In other places, there have been challenges to aggressive policing practices. That includes, for example, the use of pepper spray, of physically restraining students, of calling in police when students are having um, symptoms related to an emotional disability instead of responding through um, a health and wellness lens. Challenging practices like bringing in full-scale policing and probation initiatives, or even gang profiling. Erin has worked on some of those with us, into schools. So uh, also dress code policies that target manners of dress. I mentioned, wearing your hair in locks. Also for Latino students, often prohibitions on wearing or carrying rosaries as supposed gang insignia. So there's like a whole list of ways that we have been effective. Um, I do think that the law is generally set up to presuppose and trust that schools are looking out for students, um, and gives them a lot of leeway in that role. So there are some challenges. Students are generally perceived to have weaker or fewer rights vis-a-vis school administrators than, say, someone who is uh, in an interaction with police or the criminal legal system. So those are some challenges, but they aren't absolutes. And as I said, I think the legal cases can help shine light, can help serve as an organizing event and narrative to bring in community to conversation, to bring other people to the table, and to remove some of the worst practices. Ideally, in our settlements, we can also bring in more of these positive supports and services, more role for community in conversation. And then, citing legal rights, also students and communities can advocate for better policies, for more involvement in their systems to overturn negative practices like the use of metal detectors or invasive security practices that Erin mentioned. There's to introduce restorative practices. So again, there's a robust range of things that are available, and ways in which, the legal framework of rights and responsibilities can be marshaled to help support a move towards away from discipline, and push out towards the inclusive and nurturing schools that I think everyone would prefer ultimately.
You're muted,
Tobi, you're
Toby.
muted.
My bad. Another phenomenal answer from this amazing panel of incredibly thoughtful guests. Uh, I wanted to first, before there's one more question in the Q&A, but I wanted to call attention again to what's been posted in the chat, my email, and ways to donate, and also Shannon's organization, the Student Advocacy Center, which is a phenomenal resource for alternative programming for students in order to avoid these kinds of problems and choose a more equitable way of resolving problems in school. I'm not sure if we're going to get like flatly cut off, but I'm going to throw this question, and if we get cut off, a cliffhanger. But another question is, are there any funding gaps, more funding needed for professional development, implementing the programs mentioned, classroom supports? I think this was mentioned a little bit before by Erin, talking about, supporting schools and funding schools, but if there are any specific policies you might be thinking about in response.
So we could always use more money, right? We could always use more funding. So I'm going to never say no to more funding. However, I would say you can go to your school board and ask, what are we doing with our Title II funding? Title II specifically for professional development, right? It's money they get from the federal government. It's money that the state also supports to fund specific on professional development. So how are we using our existing Title II dollars? Because that's one of the main ways that schools fund professional development for their staff. Also in Title I, there is parent engagement money. There's parent engagement dollars that schools are required to provide supports and resources to families to bolster engagement. That's real dollars. So how are our schools using our Title I dollars to help support families in understanding and how they can actually work with their students around these kinds of restorative practices, how they can be more supportive of their students. So those are two main streams of funding that are already exist that we need to ask questions on how are they currently being funded, where are they being used, and how can we redirect those to ways that are into practices or into strategies that we know are much more productive. So that's just two things I would say right off the bat.
Can I add really quickly? We spend, that was a great answer. I agree 100%. Yes, we need more support, but we also need to look at what we're spending on. And I just wanted to add as well, we spend a lot of money on policing and punishment in schools on often very ineffective policies. So it's worth looking at how schools are spending that money already and how it can be redirected in ways that better support teaching and learning.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, Director Griffin, Professor Kupchik, Deputy Director Hinger. Thank you to everyone who has come to attend this talk. It has been lovely, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. This is great.